Given the disturbing news about the gents' lavatories, I'll try and keep the jokes to a minimum. All the seats in the house can remain dry. Now, what is a Mad Dog challenge? Well, the idea of it is that it's a supported ride, and meaning that you don't have to carry all of your kit with you on the bike. So you can go as fast as you like, as fast as you can, and try to cover as much distance as possible during a day. So after 7 days, it should be possible to cover quite a significant distance. And in this particular case, the rides I went on were Hong Kong to Hanoi, which was about 1,250 kilometers, and Singapore to Krabi, which is perhaps a little bit shorter. In the novel Kim, in my view, Rudyard Kipling's masterpiece, the eponymous hero is adopted as a sort of disciple by a Tibetan Lama on a spiritual quest. And the Lama prefers to walk, even very great distances. And at one point, though, in the book, Kim persuades him to take a train. And the Lama is amazed at this newfangled thing, and the fact that the telegraph poles whip past, flashing past the train window. He says, tall poles by the side of the road, snatching up their threads. And he expresses reservations at travelling so fast, which is a thought common to other cultures as well. There's an Arabic proverb which has it that a man who travels faster than the speed of a camel will leave his soul behind. Now that may not stand up to scientific scrutiny, and one rendering of the saying refers to a camel at walking pace, while another has the camel at a run. But anyone who's experienced jet lag after a long-haul flight will attest to the common sense of the thing. So let's assume it's a camel at a run. The speed of a camel at top speed is apparently 65 kilometers an hour, and I can report that certainly I, at no point, went that fast on my bicycle. But as well as keeping body and soul together in the same location at all times, I can say that travelling by bicycle is a first-rate way of seeing places. Quick enough to cover a sizable distance in a week, as you can see here, fairly small-scale maps of where we went, but slow enough to take note of everything and allowing one the ability to stop and have a closer look if the fancy takes you. But the other great thing about picking 2 points on the map like that and deciding to cycle from A to B is that you have to cover all the ground in between. G.K. Chesterton said that while the traveller sees what he sees, the tourist sees only what he has come to see. But on these trips between Hong Kong and Hanoi and Singapore and Krabi, I saw an awful lot. Some surprising, some mundane, some distasteful, some beautiful, but it was a full immersion. We were spared nothing and we were denied nothing. Contrast that with the flights back, where we saw nothing but the insides of planes and airports. And as the late Douglas Adams had it, it's no coincidence that in no known language in the galaxy does there exist the expression as beautiful as an airport. This is the team lineup for the Hong Kong to Hanoi trip. Emerging from the hotel in Shenzhen first thing in the morning, it represented a wide variety of different nationalities and backgrounds, and perhaps the only thing that most of them had in common, with one or two exceptions, honourable exceptions, including the chairman of the Geographical Society who's here tonight, the thing they had in common was that they could not be described as cyclists. And this was in all cases, I think, well, probably not in the case of the chairman, but in most cases at least, the first long distance ride that any of them had done. And many of us were unfamiliar with the modern clip-in pedal systems that you have to make sure that your pedal cycle is smooth at all points around the circle. And if you're unfamiliar with them and you're coming up to a traffic light and you forget that you need to twist your foot out, you just fall in an ungainly fashion, smack. Fortunately, in our case, not into the traffic. But yeah, certainly a great way to start. We got going. We got into our stride. The first day, which I'm afraid this slide doesn't depict, but it was remarkable in that it it took at least half of it to get away from Shenzhen, this sprawl. A great way to appreciate the phrase mega city is to cycle through one. And then we emerged into these more rural surroundings, but punctuated along the way by towns and cities of varying sizes. And from a physical perspective, if you've done no training, which as you heard I haven't, and that was actually the case on the second trip as well, because I thought, well, if I could get away with it the first time, I could get away with it again. The first couple of days are quite unpleasant. And on the morning of the third day, thoughts of giving up have to be quite forcibly suppressed. But in my experience at least, it improved markedly after that. Here you can see a team of cyclists in southern China lightening the load by riding in each other's slipstream, and importantly in the slipstream of a motorised tricycle, which was going at a very convenient 27 kilometres per hour, and that's just about a good pace to maintain, and you don't get the wind resistance behind that. This was Gushenshen, a lighting facility, or at least they have a lighting festival. One of the things about the towns in southern China is it's sort of like going back to the Industrial Revolution in the UK, you know, Sheffield for steel, Lancashire for cotton. Here, you know, a whole town dedicated to lighting systems. There was another whole town dedicated to stonemasonry, and a whole area dedicated to the mining and consumption of coal. Now these are the towers near Kaiping. These were built by returning expats in China, probably about 90 or 100 years ago. Really follies, but they still look quite impressive. This is Kaiping as well, but old-fashioned architecture, but you know, just this sort of general feeling of decay. In so many places in southern China, these older buildings have already given way to huge, faceless factory buildings, driven onwards really by China's economic revolution over the past 30 years. I think the environmental impact of all this in place is quite grim, and one was struck by the scale of it all. Again, travelling by bicycle really helps to emphasise that. We were even struck by the fact that all hotels in China seem to be built off the same plan, sort of centrally planned. You could be in one, you could be in another, the room looks exactly the same. But I wasn't going to complain about the beds, which were all a centrally planned, very firm bed, which I prefer. And if you just cycle 200 kilometres, you could sleep on the floor or a bed of nails. You just don't care by that stage. The mundane hotels and industrial landscape was lightened by some exotic foodstuffs that we were able to sample. Here, a restaurant specialising in swan, which I was quite, doesn't look particularly appetising. I have to say I didn't find it particularly appetising, but several of my teammates thought it was delicious. This is Wuchuan, again, you know, this sort of this sense of old architecture and decay. A typical day on one of these trips, you get up at about 5:45, 6 o'clock, depending on the time of year, depending on the time when the dawn breaks, because the idea is to spend all of the daylight hours, you know, at your disposal in the saddle. This sort of is an insurance policy really against punctures, mechanical failures. You know, you want to try and get as much of it done as early as possible. So a breakfast in the dark and then stops at petrol stations all the way through. We became connoisseurs of petrol stations in China and later in Malaysia. I could tell you my top 5 by brand. I won't do so now, but if you want to know afterwards, then you can. This is the chairman of the society on the longest day we had, and they're demonstrating the fact that you've got both sunburn and mud and just general grime off the road. That's me on the left there on a very, very hot, long piece of concrete road. And you know, we ended up looking like this, and I've just got a big mud spot there in the middle of my forehead, which I hadn't appreciated was there. Yeah. But when I was in the bike shop in Hong Kong, sort of buying equipment for this, they said, "You're going on a tour?" I said, "Well, yes. You need some detergent for your lycra. You really ideally have 2 sets of lycra and do it on rotation so that you can wash some of an evening, put it out to dry and then wear the other one the next day. But yes, the bike shop quite sniffy about tours, because they said just after a while everything starts to smell, and I have to say it did. But it was worth it for that. Yeah, it's not for the precious, but it was well worth it. A highlight of the day was lunch. Often we'd stop at a restaurant, but if that wasn't logistically possible, a car park, or indeed just a sort of empty building site like this would suffice. It wasn't without its creature comforts. You can see there's a packet of Tesco crisps there, and also a fishing bed, which the organisers had laid on, although there was only one, so it was fought over somewhat. The chairman there again, he'd had a crash, which is why his blue front wheel there, his original wheel was stoved in when he collided with a moped, and there were lots of people in China riding these very sort of characteristic bright fluorescent fixed wheel bicycles, and that was just about the only spare parts that was available. So he had to make do. You know, the forks of his bike had to be sanded down for that wheel to fit, but he soldiered on nevertheless. Here we stopped, and you know, again, just buying a drink by the side of the road. Some school children came up to us, presented us with their homework, and my friend here pretending that he reads Chinese. Finally, after I think 4 days, we reached the Vietnam border, and the contrast between that part of China, the borders of Dongqing, and Vietnam and Mong Kai on the other side, is marked. And you go from this industry, busyness, muck, dirt, to a sort of green, rural paradise, really, with nothing much happening. And it would sort of cause us to remark that there are definitely two types of socialism at work there on either side of that border. It started to rain when we entered Vietnam, and it sort of continued. And I, however, was first in at lunch on that particular day. This was my crowning achievement. I managed to beat the chairman, who had punctures. Here I was enjoying a bowl of pho, but there'd been a problem with my bike. I could just hear a knocking, and it was ominous, and I wanted to ignore it. This was a bike that I'd borrowed from the gentleman sitting there, and this was our Bulgarian mechanic who'd come from Hanoi to meet us at the border, and he was giving me the typical sort of, "Ooh, well, you know, it'll cost you" sort of routine. I was saying, "Well, it must be all right. It must be all right." He said, "Well, you just have to take it carefully." You can see the look of dejection on my face there. And then later, as we went round an enormous coal-fired power station in the rain, the dust got into my gear cables, it got into my brake cables, so the gears stopped working, and George had to turn my 18-speed bike into a 1-speed bike. And then by the time I got to the hotel that evening, I was using my feet to brake. So that was the end of that bike, thanks Richard. And I then borrowed George's bike, which was one size too small. And as you can see, it was a very muddy day. This was our friend Christina, whose hair you can see is just caked in mud from the road. That was at lunch. You can just see all the mud up our backs there. Pretty nasty. And then finally, we made it to Hanoi, although not after going the wrong way along various distributaries in the Red River Delta. A special mention goes to Vicky, who is one of our number. She really hadn't done one of these trips before, and she was perhaps the slowest but the most dogged of all of us. And she didn't tell her family that she was doing this, even when she'd finished it. She felt that the censure she'd received was not worth it, so she pretended to be on a beach holiday. This, as you can probably tell, is not Vietnam or China. This is Malaysia. This was the second trip from Singapore to Krabi, so a great contrast, and we had to get used early on to tropical cycling. And Malaysia sort of, the presence of Islam is notable. We hear the call for prayer all the way along the route, and cycling in the midday sun in the tropics is not to be taken lightly, and this is where the petrol stations really did come into their own. We had to stop between sort of 10 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have to stop just about every 30 minutes and douse yourself in water to keep the body cool. If you don't do that, then you sweat, your digestion stops working, and ultimately you probably fall off. We didn't get to that point, but the first couple of days were particularly unpleasant. You may think, is this dangerous otherwise? Is the traffic bad, etc.? And this isn't a particularly good way of illustrating it, but you can see here, generally, both in China, in Vietnam, in Malaysia and Thailand, you've got a good, wide, hard shoulder where slow traffic, including cyclists, can go. And slow traffic is expected and it is respected, and generally people know that you're there, they realise that people ride bicycles. And contrast that with, say, cycling in London or cycling in Singapore, something I now live in Singapore, but I'd only do it in the early hours of the morning. Actually, on these trips, despite these big lorries and the palm oil and all the rest of it, we felt relatively safe. Not always safe, but relatively safe. In Singapore, there's an echo of perhaps a gentler time. In the highway code, it says for drivers, look out for cyclists coming the wrong way down the road. And you'll find that cyclists, motorbikes, horse-drawn vehicles in these countries will be coming the wrong way down, which again, you've got to keep your wits about you. I mentioned palm oil. This is characteristic of Malaysia. Mile after mile after mile of this. Again, it sort of puts you in mind of the environmental impact that certain activities have. This was our very helpful driver and guide, Lau, and this was the sort of dousing ceremony which would happen every lunchtime. On one occasion we used up a bucket of ice water that happened to be left over, just because it was left over. Lau thought that we wanted ice water, and so thereafter at every lunch stop he would get the ice water and we would have to just stand there and have it tipped right down the back. Certainly wakes you up if that's what you need. Finally, we arrived in Thailand. There was a fairly significant hill on the border between Malaysia and Thailand, and then the scenery between the border and Krabi is, as you can see, really quite stunning. There were still hazards, the odd dog here and there, and finally we arrived on the beach at Krabi, although I then elected and forced my friend to join me with a day to Phuket the following day. And actually, going back to the point I made at the start about the difference between these long trips and just flying somewhere to go and be a tourist, as you come into Phuket, you're back in the familiar world of being ripped off. And generally, it was a real culture shock, and not as pleasant as it could have been. Whereas this had all been fantastic. You can see the karst scenery there. So I'm going to hand over now, but I'll just emphasise again that if you want to do one of these, then the 26th of September, the Hong Kong to Hanoi Challenge is, I think there are still a few places if you act fast. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Andrew.